Good evening again to the course at the University of Kansas, Biography of a City, Lawrence. This is the 13th session of this course, taught at the university's main campus in Lawrence. We have two really fine presenters this evening. The first is Professor Donald Worster, who grew up in Kansas, went to Hutchinson High School, and then came to the University of Kansas, where he received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English and Communications in 1963. He completed an MA in Communications in 1964, also at the University of Kansas, and then went on to Yale to complete a PhD in History and American Studies in 1971. In 1989, he was appointed the Hall Distinguished Chair of American History at the University of Kansas, and for good reason. He had written quite a number of books, to this point 10, including Dust Bowl in 1979, which won him the Bancroft Prize in History. His best-selling book is Nature's Economy, written in 1977, has been translated into 6 languages, and other books including Rivers of Empire, 1985, and currently writing a book on John Wesley Powell. Lawrence, as we all know, is connected to the rest of the world, particularly to the environment of Kansas, the region, the nation, and the whole globe. We don't just revolve around in our own orbit. We have to be interrelated to all things and all climates and all places. So I'm very happy to have Dr. Worster present his topic this evening, The Trouble with Gardens. Welcome, Don.
I'm sure neither you nor Dennis knows what this topic's about tonight. And I'm not sure if I were giving it a title I could do anything more clear than I have done. I hope you're a little tired of Lawrence at this point in this semester, because I'm not going to talk so much about Lawrence as about Kansas tonight, the land of Kansas. Somewhere in this semester, you ought to stop and remember that the city of Lawrence could not exist independent of the rest of the state. It could not survive without the land of Kansas, a land reaching all the way to the Colorado state line, some 400 miles west of here. This is a simple, obvious truth that any visit to a supermarket in Lawrence ought to tell you. Of course, these days, the products you would find on the shelves in any of our supermarkets in this town are all mixed up, the products of Kansas with the products of California, Georgia, New Jersey, Mexico, New Zealand. Our food system extends all the way around the globe. It extends to places we never go, and probably to places we don't care very much about. Nonetheless, Lawrence and all of its peoples, its households, its institutions, could not exist, and they certainly could not thrive, if the land of Kansas were in trouble. Is the land of Kansas in trouble today? It does not seem so in the supermarket. If you're listening to the happy music as you push your grocery cart up and down, you wouldn't get any inkling that the land of Kansas is in trouble. But the supermarket does not really reveal very much about the land, what's happening on the land, and to the people who live on the land. So if we want to get a fuller answer to this question that I've posed, then we need to do a little more than run quickly with a grocery cart through the fast food section or the frozen foods. We need some history and we need some careful analysis. I want to begin not by trying to answer this question directly. Instead, I want to tell you a story about the land of Kansas and about the thinking and the dreams of the people, the Americans particularly. I shouldn't use the phrase people. I'm talking specifically about Americans, white Americans who first settled here. This is a story that runs from about the time of the Civil War, the 1860s, which is the first great settlement period for white Americans in this state, up through the 1930s. That's the story I want to start with for a little bit tonight. Story that begins in the Civil War and ends in the 1930s. The story takes us back to a time when Kansas was mainly a grassland, a native prairie scattered with trees, bison, Indian villages, their crops scattered here and there, their hunting trails. And into this scene comes white Americans. In Kansas, we've tried to put this story, the beginning of this story, right on the official Kansas state seal. Could I have the first slide, please? Well, are they going to get it there? Okay. You can, when it gets on the screen, you'll see what it is. It's a sacred circle. I would call it a sacred circle. And it's filled with important symbols, images, icons. There it is. I can see it on my screen right now. Maybe I can zoom it up a little bit for you. The caption I have here says, it commemorates the state as it was at the time it ceased to be a territory. We'll come back to the as it was. And what I want to suggest here is that the symbols on this seal, all these little items, objects in the picture, in the circle, these symbols or icons, express what our ancestors thought about the land of Kansas, what their intentions and what their aspirations were. The Great Seal of Kansas, if you'll come back to this slide, foregrounds a man walking behind a team of horses plowing up a native prairie. And behind him roll covered wagons that are pulled by oxen. And in their wake stands a lone pioneer frontier cabin. While in the distance, a band of Indians pursue the herds of bison. And still farther back in this picture, you can see, I hope, can you see this clearly from where you're sitting? You can see a river, a broad river which is carrying a paddle wheel steamer downstream. And in the distance, the far distance, there's that Kansas range of mountains looming with the sun rising behind them. And then, of course, stretching across the top, there's this banner reading Ad Astra per Aspera, which we usually translate as to the stars through difficulty, our state motto. Now, never mind that the landscape of Kansas nowhere looks exactly like this. In fact, you would have to pivot Kansas around on the compass points. Instead of running east-west, you'd have to have it running north-south to get those mountains in the right place. I presume they're supposed to be the Rockies out there somewhere close to Denver. And then if you did that, if you pivoted around so the mountains would be where they're supposed to be, then the Kansas River, or whatever river that is, it looks like the Kansas to me, would be running from Nebraska down into Texas. So the seal's designer clearly was a better artist than a geographer. Now, these various images or symbols are trying to tell, I want to suggest to you, a story. Trying to tell a story about the people and the land. And the story is so familiar to everybody in this room that when you see only one or two of these images, the cabin, the plow, the bison, see only one or two of these images standing alone someplace on a page or on a wall, carving on a building, we can instantly fill in the rest of the story. We know what's going on in this story. We're so accustomed to looking at these symbols and understanding how they operate together to tell a story. And the story goes something like this. Kansas, the state of Kansas, began as an ordinary, decent, simple people of high virtue, hard work, poverty, came westward into this place, driving out the Indians and the bison before them. And with hard work, they began to build houses, they plowed and planted, and they laid the foundations for wealth and prosperity. They aimed for the stars, which can be translated to a large extent as the stars with a dollar sign, wealth, prosperity, comfort, security. Of course, we can also tell this story in slightly different terms. The wild prairie gives way to a garden, a tame landscape that is civilized, that's lovely to look at, that is fruitful, that is rich. Okay, how much of this story is true historically? Or does this story on the Great Seal of Kansas tell the whole truth about our history and what we've been up to? How closely has the real history of Kansas followed nicely along the lines that I've just sketched out here? And how closely has our history delivered on these hopes expressed in the picture? Did we get a secure, beautiful, prosperous garden out of the wild prairie? As we look around Lawrence, Topeka, western Kansas, how would we answer that question today? Now, I'm not going to try to answer that one, to evaluate the beauty of this transformed landscape. I'll leave that to you, to your standards of taste and judgment. I'd go out Iowa Street, past Walmart, and keep going and see, for yourself. But I can, and I will argue that the history of the land of Kansas has been a lot more chaotic and a lot more complicated and at times a lot more tragic than you would ever know from looking at our Great Seal. Let's add a few details into this picture of the seal. In the later 1860s, just a few years after Kansas was established, the railroads began slicing across the state, across the prairie, and along their tracks began to appear a series of evenly spaced towns, small brick and wooden towns, each of them overshadowed by grain elevators. People began to plant crops, corn, wheat, to raise fruit trees, potatoes, chickens, pigs, cattle, and then to send those products off to Kansas City, especially to Chicago, earning cash. And they used that cash, I'm condensing a hell of a lot of history here, but they used the cash to create something more than a log cabin or a sod house to live in. They built towns, they built farmhouses, and for a while life seemed to get very good on the Kansas land. Let's jump ahead of that seal, and the picture in that seal, to the year 1887. Could I have the next slide, please? The year 1887 saw the publication of the official State Atlas of Kansas. You can find it in the Spencer Research Library, the Kansas collection. It provides a progress report on the Great Seal. And what you see on the screen in front of you is a page from that atlas. Out of this checkerboard of the land survey, a farm is beginning to appear, very neat, very orderly, and of course very square. We like things very square in the state of Kansas, with a farm in the middle of it and these roads going along the side. Let me have another slide, please. Well, I guess I can make this go forward. There you go. Let's back up on this one if we can get a little more of the picture in. This state atlas is interesting. It's not just maps. It's full of pictures, drawings of houses that have appeared on the Kansas landscape by this point. Elegant, prosperous farms are all through this atlas. They were sketched by traveling artists, and to get your house put into the picture or into the atlas, you had to pay a substantial cost. It wasn't free. So it was kind of an advertising for self. And these are the residences and the ranches and farms of Kansas's most successful individuals who want to show off their accomplishments, as in this picture, a great beautiful Victorian house, carriages, fountains in the yard, a forest beginning to grow, and expensive, elegant barns. Wealth is the theme on every page, wealth taken out of the land. Now, with more and more of this agricultural production comes a sophistication in these pictures, a sophistication that resembles Europe, England. This is not the raw, ugly frontier anymore. A land of the homespun clothing and plows and all that. Wealth here in these pages is now producing beauty, culture, refinement. I think these pictures have a slightly English look to them. This, by the way, is the Spring Hill Ranch out in Chase County, where the new Kansas Tallgrass National Prairie Park stands. That's the great farmhouse there with the barn off on the side. Built in the 1880s, just about the time this atlas is coming out. These pictures to me suggest the country estates of Devon or Suffolk in England, or a deer park in the Cotswolds of England. In other words, this atlas is suggesting to people at this period that Kansas is beginning to boast its own landed gentry. It is a cultivated class of people who can hold their own with all the aristocrats of England. They've acquired old world breeding stock, as well as architectural patterns. This is, I can't remember where this one's from, but here you see that incredible forest that's beginning to grow up. Of course, all the trees planted exactly in orderly patterns, marching very carefully together. And here's another one that has, as I say, an English deer park. These deer, the elk are all gone, the bison are gone. We brought in back into the deer, into a deer park with this Victorian architecture. And as I said, they get their own breeding stock, fat cattle with English and Scottish names, Herefords. And on these estates you begin to see an impressive array of ponds, Victorian cottages, carriage lanes, just like the wealthy class of England are building during this very same period. Here's a picture I really like. They get the cows also all lined up in front in even rows to sort of show prosperity. We say prosperity, and these are all English breeds, of course. This new land also begins to promote the growth of cities. Like the farms, these towns and cities have a prosperous English Victorian look. Here, for example, it could be Lawrence, but it happens to be McPherson, Kansas. Looks just like McPherson. And then here is the, well, I missed one here. I guess we'll just skip that one. Anyway, you see the pictures of these towns and so forth, obviously laid out with expectations of prosperity. This official state atlas, 1887, includes up in the corners of the pages, and this is one on the screen now, a few reminders of what Kansas looked like, supposedly, just a couple of decades ago. Here, emigrating to Kansas, 1856, to remind people next to these Victorian mansions and these great ranches. Oh, that's the one I wanted. That happens to be Harrington, Kansas, a town laid out just exactly on the square again, promising what? Endless growth. I mean, we can just keep on adding streets endlessly till we are right on the edge of Denver. And that's another little picture from up in the corners. So they got these little log cabins way up in the corners to remind people, here is what we once were in an older era. Well, the atlas does not, however, tell us a lot more than the Great Seal did about all the failures and the hardships, difficulties through the stars, through difficulty. There aren't too many difficulties suggested in these places. Windstorms, tornadoes, hailstorms, not in here. Drought, heat, cold, blizzards, lightning fires, blowing dirt. For example, in the mid-1870s, a horde of grasshoppers, Rocky Mountain locusts, they were called then, came descending over the land, chewing up the crops in the ground, chewing even the laundry hanging on the clothesline. Some of contemporary observers began to warn the balance of nature is upset, and we are getting in the shift from prairie to agriculture, and these insects consequently are becoming a plague. This happened before the atlas appeared, but it too is forgotten. During the 1890s, just a few years after the atlas was published, the rain stopped pretty much across the state of Kansas, and the line of settlement fell back very quickly and very abruptly. Whole counties in the western part of the state suddenly depopulated. A number of counties in western Kansas lost 90% of their population through the drought years of the 1890s. People picking up, broke, discouraged, busted. But by this point, Kansans had got pretty good at looking only at the bright side of things. which is another way of saying that they got pretty good at editing out the problems that they were having, or in some cases that they were creating, in order to celebrate the wealth, the production, the success. That is, I think they were very good at this until the decade of the 1930s, and this is where I want to end this little story. In the early 1930s, the rains stopped again. Around 1932, again pretty much across the state. They stopped or they declined, and in this case for a much longer period of time than they had stopped in any previous decade of white settlement. And this time the high winds of the Great Plains began lifting up the soil, the bare soil, where those green fields in the atlas were supposed to be. And now we begin to get a whole new series of images of Kansas from cameras rather than from artists. If you'll give me the next slide, please. This is from April 14, 1935. This is April 14, 1998, 63 years later. So we're on the anniversary of this important event. A dust storm which rolled across the plains out near Garden City. That was the day when the infamous Dust Bowl made its debut up and down the Great Plains. It followed a February heat wave. All through March, dust began blowing across Kansas, and for the next 6 weeks it was unusual to see a clear, sunny sky from morning till night. In mid-March of that year, a train was derailed in the state because of dust on the tracks, and the travelers were forced to find their shelter wherever they could. In the following days, electric lights in many parts of the state were kept on continuously, and the schools and offices closed. And then, as I said, we ended up with April 14, 1935. Could I have the, well, I can put this forward. I don't depend on this. These are all from that year. There are many, many storms in preceding years, of very large scale indeed, and several in the year 1935, but this is the infamous day. It's called Black Sunday in Kansas history. It started off very clear and rosy, actually, that day, April 14th, but suddenly there appeared on the horizon, moving at railroad speed, an immense boiling cloud of dirt. It issued no warning. People saw it coming with complete silence across the plains, and by afternoon it had turned a large part of western Kansas into night. This is actually an earlier storm, as you can see from the date on this, March 30th, but it's a dust storm, Dodge City at 10 a.m. Out on those farms in the Atlas, the livestock were blinded. They began to run around in circles. They breathed so much dust that their lungs were filled, many of them suffocated. Cattle climbed out over the fences that had been covered over by dust. The carcasses of wildlife, birds, were lying along the roads, choked, dead. And inside the farmhouses across this state, families were huddling around kerosene lanterns, barely able to see the light on the table in some cases because so much dust had entered the room through the cracks around the windowsills. The kitchen air itself turned thick and very gloomy in many houses. I don't have any interior pictures for you, but this again is from western Kansas in that spring. Such storms as this was the peak year, but in terms of the intensity of these storms, but they continued pretty much on a regular basis every spring and fall through the rest of the 1930s. 30, 40, 50 storms a year through the rest of the 1930s. And the upshot of them, and this I'll move to, the upshot was economic devastation, loss of livestock, loss of crops, destruction of property, furrows filled in with dirt, buildings covered over with dirt. These winds blew soil from the western part of this state to eastern Kansas. They turned the skies in this city of Lawrence brownish, reddish. They blew dirt all the way to Chicago. Several million tons of dirt came down on Chicago in one dust storm, to New York City, to Washington, D.C., and on out into the Atlantic Ocean. This is actually out near Liberal, Kansas, by the end of the 1930s. And as you can see, this house is abandoned. And of course, there was all these factors working together forced a massive outmigration of population from many parts of the state. Okay, one of the 20th century's greatest environmental catastrophes anywhere on Earth occurred in this decade of the 1930s, and that catastrophe occurred right here in the state of Kansas, along with Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska, well into Canada. The Great Seal, again, that we started with a few minutes ago, does not prepare us for this Dust Bowl disaster, nor does the official state atlas. If you read those, you'd never get a sense of what was coming down the line. What had gone wrong? What had destroyed so much of this garden so quickly? Kansans have come up with several answers to explain why their relationship to the land had turned out so badly by the 1930s. One answer was that it was nature, in the form of drought, that had brought this tragedy onto the state. It was nature's fault. It was an act of God. That was commonly used in language. You'll still hear people explaining things that way today. But other Kansans acknowledged, and in my own historical work, I believe I have discovered and have proven a more complete and complicated truth. That is, that people in this state had a hand in the creation of this disaster. It was not simply an act of God. It was in some part man-made. And let me just suggest what that was. By the time of World War I, if I could have the next slide, there were new inventions like this on the Kansas landscape, not on the Great Seal, but this is replacing the old tractor and plow. Self-propelled tractors, combines, thresher harvesters invading the Kansas landscape. Through the 1920s, farmers put this technology to work plowing up the entire high plains, up and down, by millions of acres, essentially turning the countryside, much of the high plains, into an industrial factory for mass-producing wheat and other commodities. They made a lot of money doing this. In fact, in some seasons, people could pay for an entire farm with one year's harvest. They were caught up in an economic boom that swept this state like a fever as it swept the entire nation, the 1920s, Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera. Here is then a kind of a new symbol that is beginning to appear on the Kansas landscape, a man at work on a gasoline tractor, or in this case, a man directing the work of several other tractor drivers. This is a man out near Scott City who had a huge farming corporation with many, many teams of farmers and mechanized equipment. Nowhere in this picture is there any reminder of that 1887 official atlas, that English garden landscape, you know, the carriages and the barns, the wrought iron fences. They're gone, as are the log cabins and the wagons and the paddle wheel steamers. How did we get from one to the other? We got there, I want to suggest, by attitudes that were present from the beginning in those very early images of the land. If you take these pictures seriously in the 1930s, take the 1930s seriously, and for a long time, historians did not pay much attention to Kansas when it got to the 30s. The interesting part always stopped before that. Then rural Kansas no longer looked like anything that had been foretold in the pioneer days. Instead of a steady march of progress year by year, there came economic and ecological catastrophe. And with it came, for a lot of people in this state, a gnawing, harsh sense of humiliation and of failure. I mean, I know my parents and family went through those years and felt humiliated, felt the failure intensely in the loss of land, farms, etc. Kansans, along with other people in this region of the country, began praying for help, specifically the federal government, to rescue them from this disaster, and the federal government did. Government aid began to flow into this state. And during the 1930s, the federal government spent in Kansas and the other Great Plains states over $1 billion, over $1 billion. This is 1930s dollars in aid from the government, which did a lot to keep some people on the land and stabilize their environmental condition. New farming techniques came in, new conservation measures came in. The government in some cases retired land from production, and it still is in federal ownership. End of story. The Dust Bowl years, which happened contrary to all expectations, are still an experience that I think we Kansans have trouble remembering or absorbing. They were a setback, we say. We survived, we got back on track, and so forth. Now let's move on to another story. This one begins right after World War II. I think there is an important shift in Kansas, as there is in the United States with World War II. This new story begins, a new chapter in the history of Kansas, and it starts off on a much brighter note than the last one ended. Around 1941-42, rains began to come back. World markets began to boom economically all over the world, and Kansas was once more off to the races. After World War II, the state of Kansas found what it hoped would be a long-term savior, something that would help us never to experience another Dust Bowl, prevent it from ever happening again. And that savior was nothing less than irrigation. If I could have the next slide, please. Deep well irrigation, not taken from rivers or streams, but pumping water from deep within the earth, from this vast aquifer, these water-bearing sands and gravel that lie tens, hundreds of feet under the Kansas land surface. It required powerful pumps fueled by gasoline and natural gas, and these began to be marketed widely up and down the Great Plains in the 1950s, promising that the color green would now become the permanent color of the state. We would never have to suffer from drought or blowing dust again. In fact, as one agricultural official put it in the 1960s, we have now perfected a climate-free agriculture. Whenever we want it, we will turn on the faucet and we will let nature do what it wants. We have a climate-free agriculture. In the 1950s, as in this picture, and in the 60s, and in still some parts of the state today, this water was brought up from deep within the ground and made to run down these very straight rows of crops. But by the 1960s, the landscape began to show a dramatically different face. You've seen them if you've flown over this countryside. These are some of the pumps that have been perfected, burning fossil fuels. This is what I'm getting at. These large round circles drawn by center pivot irrigation systems in the midst of the old square checkerboard of Kansas. Other new shapes and structures begin to appear on the land, as in this picture. We're back to squares again. Feedlots, cattle feedlots, where hundreds of thousands of animals are brought off the range, put into these giant pens, and fattened on feed grains, which by and large are grown with irrigation, with deep well irrigation. In fact, much of the meat industry in the United States shut down as a consequence of all this and moved out into western Kansas, the Texas Panhandle. Meat packing industry followed, landing strips, outbuildings, slaughterhouses, and somewhere in all of the shrubbery, irrigated shrubbery, the all-electric, air-conditioned rural house. A very, very productive factory by the 1960s, producing more wheat than Americans could eat. By the 1960s, we were shipping half of the wheat in the United States, half of the wheat crop of Kansas, overseas, not to the Lawrence supermarket. Okay, that first story I told you a little while ago about Kansas land lasted from the Civil War up to the 1930s, through the 30s, 60 or 70 years. This new story that starts unfolding after World War II is now in its 50th year. So far, this is not as long a story that's going on. How is it going to turn out over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Is it going to turn out differently than the last one? Is it going to have a happier ending this time? Prosperity, economic growth forever, for all time? Well, of course, we cannot even remotely answer these questions. We certainly can't answer them by looking at the past. There is no question that whatever story we're writing in Kansas today is not going to look exactly like anything we ever wrote before. Each story is different. Each has a different outcome. However, I want to suggest that we can acknowledge that there are some very big and very difficult problems that are beginning to show up in our use of land in this state now that we're 50 years into the second story. These problems are getting more serious, not less. And they have the potential to create not another Dust Bowl, exactly as the last one, but certainly a decline in agriculture, a decline in food production, a decline in rural stability that will have very large consequences for people all over the state, at the university, sitting in classrooms, people in the city of Lawrence. Let's briefly review what these major problems are. I'm not going to give you a lot of data, but just concentrate on the broad trends that are becoming evident out there on the land. First, and this is one I'm sure virtually everybody in the state has heard about, the depletion of the water on which much of Kansas productivity has come to depend. This irrigation is based on fossil water. Fossil water. This is water that is 1 million years old, deposited at the rate of 1 inch or 2 per year over a period of a great span of time. Irrigation from fossil water is a kind of mining operation. State water engineer would admit this as much as any of us. It depletes the supply. Eventually, this groundwater mining must deplete the whole supply, or at least as much of it as we can effectively reach. Now, we've had some recent efforts in this state to slow the rate of depletion, groundwater management districts. They've had some modest success, but only some. A few years ago, the Kansas State Water Office calculated that the aquifers in this state, particularly in the western part, will be drawn down heavily by the year 2020. That's 22 years from now. And in fact, they go on to say that 75% of irrigated agriculture in Kansas will probably go out of production by that date. To my knowledge, they have not updated this study or prediction, even if it's off a few years. We're talking about 22 years from now, the possibility of 75% of irrigated agriculture going out of production. And already parts of this country have begun to turn brown. And some of the circular fields across this state have begun to drift over with blowing dirt. But I have the next slide, please. Abandoning center pivot irrigation systems. By the way, the incredible depletion that's been going on has had the unintended consequence of depleting many surface streams and rivers, which are fed by springs coming from deep sources, threatening their ecology. Let's see if I've got another one on here that I can put up. Okay, well, that's standing underneath one of these center pivot irrigation rigs that where the water has been pretty well depleted. Okay, that's one problem that is beginning to show up on the horizon. Number two, since World War II, the Kansas land has absorbed an exponential increase in the use of man-made chemicals. You know what they are: inorganic fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. Each decade in this 50 years of the story has seen new chemical products come on the market, produced with names like Monsanto, etc., and they have, no doubt about it, there is no question, they have enabled us to extract more and more production from our land. Of course, the obvious question is, can we keep on increasing this dependency forever? At what point does it become prohibitively expensive for most farmers? Or at what point does it become impossibly dangerous for human health or the ecosystem? The Kansas River, because of these chemicals, is now on one environmental organization's national list of most endangered rivers. Despite its relatively low population density, actually Kansas ranks high in a whole series of categories of pollution statewide. And much of that pollution is a result of chemicals which we have perfected, produced, sold, and applied since World War II. At, again, increasing rates of consumption and use. 3, another problem in post-war land use that's going to have a powerful effect on Lawrence, or wherever you live in this state. The soils of this state continue to erode from our plowed fields and to erode at levels that are comparable to those of the dirty 30s. Not erosion in this case from wind. That still happens. It still happens at times severely. But most of this erosion is the result of water running over the land or running over a cornfield, not the result of wind. Some observers, like Wes Jackson, MacArthur Fellow, president of the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, argue that this continuing loss of topsoil in Kansas and other states is the most serious long-term problem we face in our agriculture and in our land use. These costs do not show up. In fact, they're invisible to most people. They don't show up often even in a lifetime. They show up over a century, long after the people whose lands are eroding are dead. I would add that this invisible threat of soil erosion, this loss of soil through erosion processes, ought to be paired with another related problem, and that is the loss of soil and good farmland through urban sprawl. It's true that only about 5% of the land surface in this state, the last time I checked statistics, about 5% is developed. That is covered by highways, golf courses, housing tracts, strip malls, and the like. But this percentage is going up, and in some parts of the state it is going up very fast, especially on the fringes of urban areas like Lawrence, Kansas. The loss of prime quality farmland is accelerating. The bottomlands, the flat level lands, the places of deep soil, the places free of rocks, this is where the real estate builder is most intent on putting a mall or a suburb. Another potentially destabilizing threat to the Garden of Kansas is the future supply and cost of energy. This whole landscape, this whole story since World War II, and even before, is based on cheap, abundant fossil fuel energy in the form of petroleum and natural gas. In fact, I think it's hard to exaggerate just how important cheap fossil fuels have been to the use of land in this state in the 20th century. If we were going to draw a new great seal, we would certainly have to put an oil well on it, and not one, but one in every corner with several refineries. But of course, this is not a symbol that's going to last. It wasn't there in the 19th century imagination of pioneers, and it's not going to be there in the landscape of the future. It's going to go the way of the log cabin. And finally, a wholly new kind of threat has come to hover over the Kansas garden. Because of the burning of these fossil fuels, the world's climate pattern may already be starting to change, and to change in ways that nobody can predict. Now, this is a complicated issue that only atmospheric scientists are qualified to do research on and to make pronouncements about, not politicians who are talking endlessly about it today, not businessmen who have opinions, not farmers, and certainly not historians. But for more than a decade, scientists have been collecting data and studying this issue. And you can read their views. They're not hard to obtain. And they have reached a strong consensus. Hundreds and hundreds of atmospheric scientists gathered together in groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you've read that essay. Burning fossil fuels at current rates will at some point have an effect on the world's climate. What will it mean? What kind of effect are we talking about? Some parts of the world, strangely, may get cooler, colder. This is a prediction that's beginning to emerge from some computer studies. Places like Western Europe may enter into a new ice age, a disaster for them. Other places may get wetter, which of course can be good or bad. Still other places are going to get warmer and drier. And what do you suppose of those choices is going to be the effect in Kansas? Nobody knows completely. But there have been some computer models, and they do suggest on the whole that the average temperatures in Kansas may rise over the next few decades, by the middle of the next century, by more than 8 degrees centigrade. That is, the mean temperature of the state may go up to more than 8 degrees centigrade. And what that will mean is simply hotter, drier summers, less rainfall. If it happens, we Kansans are going to have to take some responsibility for this outcome. Our state is among the highest per capita users of fossil fuels in the nation, way above the state average across the country, and way, way above the norm in other countries of the earth. Well, let me wrap this up with a few concluding comments. These are serious problems that are showing up or will show up in the near future across the land of Kansas. They're making our relationship with the land more troubled than at any time since World War II. Are they going to interact, all of these things working together, to create for us another tragedy? A slow, inexorable tragedy, a quick, dramatic tragedy, or will miraculous technological breakthroughs occur, new sources of energy, new sources of water, new substitutes for soil? The first one I think you can pretty well count on, new substitutes for energy. New substitutes for soil? In any case, it is impossible to say with any assurance how these things are going to interact. What we can say, I think, is that the story that we have been writing on the land over the past half century seems in its turn now to be coming to an end. Or we can use another word. Our modern way of using land in Kansas is unsustainable. Is unsustainable. It cannot go on indefinitely. And then we have a couple of options. We can change, create a new set of technologies, practices, behaviors, new ways of using land, new attitudes, or we can refuse to change. And in that case, we might have an unhappy ending to our current story to write. In either case, whether we work out over the next decade a sustainable way of using land in this state, a sustainable relationship with the environment, or whether we do not do so, and both options are there in human history. Whether we work out one or the other, we are inevitably facing, I think, a new story about Kansans and their relationship to the land, which will begin to unfold probably within your lifetime. End of my second story, and end of my spiel. Questions? Is that what you like to do at this point? Okay. Come on, who's got a question here? Comment? Yes, you.
I was wondering, you had mentioned the changes of the shapes and the lands and the way they laid out the farms. What purpose does it serve to have the land in a circular shape? You were mentioning irrigation. I didn't quite understand.
Okay, well, a center pivot irrigation rotates on a pivot in a big circle and spray. It's like your lawn sprinkler at home that goes around in a circle. So it's simply that particular technology. You set it over a well, you pump the water out, and you spread it. The advantage of these over running it down those rows is you can go over all kinds of land, which means you can go over sandy land or land that, in old days we would never have tried to plow or put crops on, sorghums or something like that. But that's why you get those big circles. It's just because of that technology, period. And then you get these wildly interesting patterns of these checkers on the checkerboard. And who's winning? Another question, yes, or comment?
You talk about the future of the land use and different solutions and possible problems. There was talk about turning the Great Plains back into the Buffalo Reserve. What is your
People
opinion
still
of
talking
that?
about that?
Well,
Yeah.
I just remember it from a couple years ago,
Yeah.
and the great movement was for that. And what's
There
your
was a lot
opinion-
of...
Yeah, what's your opinion on that?
Well, the people who propose it have made some dramatic changes in what they're proposing. I don't know what they stand for anymore. Their first phrase was Buffalo Commons. And what they meant to suggest was that there were large parts of the Great Plains that cannot survive economically if you take away federal aid, federal subsidies in the form of crop subsidies, in the form of Social Security, welfare, et cetera, et cetera. If you take all those props away, these places could not survive. So in effect, all parts of the country are subsidizing an uneconomic venture. And we've been doing this in some places since the 1930s. And their argument was that we could simply deprivatize those places, make them public lands, or turn them over to some sort of conservation group and restore them to the bison. Bring the bison back on them and restore some of them to great grasslands national parks. You'd make more money out of tourism, ecotourism, than you'd ever make, and they wouldn't be a drain on the rest of the country. You can imagine what people in those counties said, so that's probably the reaction you're hearing from it. I don't propose that or support that in its wholesale way, but I think those people, they were from New Jersey. They got a lot of flack for being from New Jersey. We're right about a couple of things. We got to look at the long-term viability of some of our settlements up and down Great Plains. Now, most of what they were talking about were in the Dakotas, so Kansas is a little bit. But there are counties in Kansas that still are less than 5 people per square mile. And how much cost does it to take out of the society, the nation, to keep those going? Who pays for it? If you withdraw the props, they're going to fall. And shouldn't we be prepared to do some planning, thinking about how those people can be helped and how the land can be helped towards some future? It's not easy to face those questions, and we have not faced them since the 1930s, really. But I think they did us a service in bringing those issues up and saying to people in Kansas and other states, here, these are your situations, deal with it. You better think about dealing with it. Yes, over here.
In talking about what you were saying, what we're going to have to do in order to maintain that it won't get worse, either reorganizing what we're going to do chemically or trying to get the soil anyway. With the way people sort of are, we've got problems with the earth, we got problems with recycling, we need to do this and that, but do you think it's just going to require us being told we have to do it as opposed to trying to encourage or influence people to say, hey, maybe you should try this and that? I mean, is it going to eventually just be the government coming down and saying, you're going to have to do this?
Well, I think we're going to have more laws and regulations.
Yeah.
We're also going to have more incentives to do things differently. I think that you can work it both ways. You can work carrot and you can work stick, but laws and regulations, in my mind, are not an evil force always in every way. But I think also if our media do their job, if our politicians do their job, and if the professors do their job, and people begin to understand what is going on and the trends and the history more accurately, and get the data that's out there, even though we don't always know the answers. I have a lot of faith and trust that most people in this country have got common sense and rationality and will move to do the right things. There are examples, as I suggested, in history where people have just refused to see the writing on the wall.
Mhm.
The classic case that everybody uses is way off in the Pacific Ocean, Easter Island. Well, those great statues standing up there, just, who built them? And what's there now in the way of a culture and civilization? The United States is not immune to failures in this way, but I have a little more optimism and confidence that we learn from history, and we're rational people, and we can sort this out, and we will probably sort it out. My hunch is pretty optimistic we'll sort these things out, but they're going to take some real dislocations. Well, you had one question. I'll come back to you after I've asked this one on the front row. You.
Introduce my second guest for the second segment of this program this evening, Mark Buehler, whom I will be interviewing along with students on building Lawrence of the 1990s. Mark is a fifth generation Lawrencian. His great-great-grandfather was Jonathan F. Morgan, who came to Lawrence in 1854 with the first settlers party of the New England Immigrant Aid Society. J.F. Morgan didn't have wealth in Massachusetts, and he sought opportunity in Lawrence, where he established a farm south of the Watson Library. Morgan's son, Gibby, held the horses while William Quantrill's men burned the farmhouse. About 100 years later, in 1954, Mark Buehler was born in Garden City, and his folks moved back to Lawrence in 1958, where Mark attended Pinckney School, West Junior High School, Central Junior High School, and Lawrence High School. Mark graduated from the University of Kansas in 1977 with a Bachelor of General Studies degree in Personnel Administration. He then worked for 9 years at Lawrence Savings and Lawrence Federal as a lending officer. And in 1986, he joined Stevens Real Estate, where he continues to work today. Mark has been very engaged in the community for many years. He served on the County Development Block Grant Advisory Board, 5 years on the Lawrence-Douglas County Planning Commission and has been elected twice to the Douglas County Commission, which he has chaired for 2 years, once in 1992 and again in 1997. So his years with the commission span the decade of the 90s. He's been most closely associated with the building of the South Lawrence Traffic Way, but is also credited with mediating the property tax appraisal revolt, working hard to push through the construction of the new county jail, and developing the public health campus across from the Lawrence Memorial Hospital. And in my pre-interviews with him, I learned that he comes from a family of staunch Democrats, although he joined the Republican Party in the 1980s. And he announced today in the Lawrence Journal-World that he would not seek re-election to the county commission. I guess, as many other politicians have said recently, it's time to go back to the family. But nevertheless, I think he will remain one of the most engaged community members we have, and I want to welcome Mark to this class.
Thanks very much.
Let's start with the Lawrence Traffic Way, which certainly is symbolic of what has happened to Lawrence politically in the 1990s. And I hope that you will join me in my questioning of him. You can see that we have a map of the traffic way, at least the eastern leg, that has yet to be built. Well, Mark, in your first campaign, your slogan was, "If you want the road, vote for me." Obviously, you were referring to the South Lawrence Traffic Way, only 9 miles of which have been built. What are the prospects of the traffic way being finished within the next 5 years? What are the problems? What are the biggest obstacles in your view?
Well, to reflect back on the campaign in 1990, the slogan kind of was that I supported the concept of a circumferential traffic loop around the city of Lawrence. And for those of you that remember, there's also an Eastern Parkway component to that the city was kind of handling in the South Lawrence Traffic Way, which the county was dealing with. Your question regards the prospect for the completion of the traffic way and what kind of challenges we have. Our challenges on that last 5 miles are pretty tremendous. We are trying to use, in my opinion, the best of 4 terrible alignments to build that roadway and to connect a link from basically Topeka to Kansas City, create an opportunity to alleviate some traffic that this community suffers every day from the bypass traffic that's interested in getting through Lawrence to get somewhere else. Another goal of that traffic way was to create some reasonable local access and allow it to be a local traffic relief for 23rd specifically for people that didn't have an interest in negotiating 23rd but did need to get from east to west. There's obviously a long history with that. We've got tremendous challenges. We're in the 10th Circuit District Court right now, and the next stop there is the Supreme Court, so we're kind of a ways up the ladder. We're in an appeal on that, and we'll probably hear something in the fall regarding that decision. But obviously we have an issue regarding the concerns and spiritual and educational mission of Haskell Indian Nations University. And we do have the Baker Wetlands on the south, many of you know about and have been there. And what we're trying to accomplish is to use an alignment that has the least negative impact of all the alignments that we have down here. And there's, like I said, this is the best of 4 bad choices. And some believe that there's yet a 5th or a 6th. And actually we're living the 6th choice, which is don't build it. And that's what you see on 31st Street today, which is around 12,000 cars a day, totally unabated, noise, sound, drainage, all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of challenges with that roadway.
What do you think the chances are that it will remain a road to nowhere, as it's been called, that it won't be built?
I think it'll be built. I don't know when, but I think that alignment will eventually be used. And I think I say that because I honestly believe that that Haskell, a very important piece to this puzzle, also has some serious concerns about unabated traffic on their southern boundary. And they do have concerns about the wetlands, as does Baker, as does many of the people in this community, as do I. And they perceive that, that the no-build, which is what we're living through today, is also their worst choice. So I'm hopeful that we can create a situation where we can build that roadway. Yes, ma'am.
This is a very elementary question, but can you explain the map and the
Yes,
different?
be happy to.
I don't mean to jump the gun. Is that?
We're going to get to that one right
Okay.
now because that's a
I'm
very
sorry.
pertinent question. Thank you for that question. Just to give you a little bit of historical background as a part of that question, in a 1971 KDOT study that recommended this trafficway around Lawrence, KDOT, which is the Kansas Department of Transportation, argued that the roadway should go south of the Wakarusa River and specifically stated that it should not go through the Haskell-Baker wetlands. I'm not sure that Mark knows what happened to that recommendation, but it's certainly different than what we've ended up doing because we're not considering an alignment south of the Wakarusa, although a lot of people have argued we should do so. So this might be a time for you to get into these different alignments and discuss them with us, the pros and cons of each of them.
Okay.
And please come in, of course.
Discussion about a good southern route around, quite frankly, around the campus of the university has always been talked about. As early as the 60s, discussion about a southern access across the city of Lawrence. If you think about Lawrence, we don't have very good east-west traffic, and quite frankly, north-south, because we have a tremendous asset sitting right in the, to me, it's still the middle of the community, and that's KU. So we've had numerous studies and recommendations, and you mentioned that today about the 71 Highway Department recommendation. The only recollection I have of that, I was a junior in high school at the time, not caring much about anything except driving, not where it went. But my recollection from people I've talked to is that we had some choices back then, and we spent our commitment back then to deal with an extension from 23rd and Iowa out to Clinton Lake, which we now refer to as Clinton Parkway. That project began back then when the dam was built and Clinton Lake was put in. And I think it was one of those, you know, what do you want? I think the community interest wanted to go there, and so they did. We have always tried to deal with that southern boundary, and of course, as you know, in the 50s, Highway 10 is 23rd Street. Our intent on planning was a little different than it would be today, and strip development occurred, and I think everybody considers that not the best way to build your world these days. But one of the shortfalls of that development along 23rd Street was how shallow the commercial district is. Many people have talked about frontage roads. If any of you are from Wichita and you've driven on Kellogg, you know how much fun that is, but they at least tried some frontage roads and then they failed, and they're trying some other things too. But the narrowness of development along 23rd Street doesn't allow you much flexibility unless you relocate those businesses and just buy them out to get them out of your way. So anyway, this particular project started in the 80s, and certain alignments were talked about. And south of the river, if you're interested in this project, south of the river has always been mentioned as the best idea. And if you'll look at that, this is the river, the Wakarusa River, and regardless of how your alignments were going to work, you were going to find a way to cross that river 2 times, negotiate the floodplain, and get back up here to Highway 10.
So this is Highway 59 right here. Let's sort of orientate them. Highway 59, and here's 31st Street going through, and this is 23rd.
23rd's up here.
23rd's up here.
Goes on east to
Okay.
K10.
And here's Haskell, right over here.
Haskell is right. Baker's here.
Here's the Baker Wetlands, and
So
here's Haskell.
Their campus,
Okay,
basically.
here's Broken Arrow Park. Okay, all right.
So many thought that the south of the river idea was the best. It does build 2 bridges. Originally, this approved alignment was designed to be a local project. But when I say a local project, I mean it was designed to use as little right-of-way taking as possible, take as few houses as possible. Quite frankly, we were originally going to use the existing grades or the pavement that you see there on 31st, on the core road we call it, that used to, it's the part of the traffic way that is built, that goes from 6th Street or Highway 40 south. We were going to use existing alignment, existing pavement there, do an overlay, but basically just rework it and go, and try to use as little, take as little right-of-way as possible. And with that thought in mind, did get federal money in the amount of $10 million. The community committed 3 or 4.
Through a vote, right?
Through a vote. And there's been discussion and other sides to all this from the beginning. But
Now that vote didn't vote on an alignment, it just voted on the funds, right?
right. And there's people that have challenged all aspects of this road. If you didn't like this road, it's not because you didn't have lots of chances to not like it. There have been a tremendous amount of controversy over this road. We had issues, environmental issues, obviously, with the wetlands. Agnes the Frog ran against the person that served in the district prior to me. She got a few votes too. This has been classic Lawrence, classic Douglas County in terms of educated opinions on both sides of this issue. And then lots of people in the middle just either wanting something done or wanting something done with it. So anyway, the alignments were designed you have to believe that you want to relieve traffic on 23rd Street or none of this works. And there are people that don't think we have a traffic problem on 23rd. And if you believe that, then this is $80 million thrown down the drain. But there are those that believe it. I'm not joking. We don't have traffic problem on 23rd. Or if we do, this is not the way to fix it, okay? There is a theory that I believe. I'm not a traffic way engineer, but there's a theory that I believe if I want to relieve the problem here, the closest relief that people will use will create the most relief. In other words, if I'm going to relieve this traffic by making you go here or here, this one, in my opinion, will take most of the traffic. And most of the models show that. They're linear models that's been challenged by I don't know, lots of people, smart people, said those concepts and all that model is not worth a hoot. I don't know if it's worth a hoot or not. I know that KDOT tells us that we'll relieve more traffic here than we will here, and I choose to believe that. So we're trying to relieve some traffic here. We're trying to create connections to the community so relief can occur internally as well as east-west that we've talked about. We're trying to take the fewest number of wetland acres that we can. We're trying not to cross 2 floodplains and spend the money. Money is an issue too. To some people that's not important, but to many it is. And then historically, the planning documents of Douglas County and the city of Lawrence have shown that they're not quite ready for Lawrence, Kansas to grow south of the Wakarusa River. Now, there are those that want to, and someday it probably will. But in my opinion, if you want to encourage municipal development south of that river, start it off with a good, nice road. So those are the basic reasons that we kept moving it up and up and up, and tried to thread this needle along 31st Street in an effort to have as little mitigation as possible. Yes, ma'am.
You know, and what you said, that this would be help people to get from Topeka to Kansas City, and you're thinking people who don't live in Lawrence. So, you know, you're talking about people who are going to use it in Lawrence, and you're talking about people who are not going to use it that don't live in Lawrence.
Right.
And originally the whole thing had stated that this would be around Lawrence. And 31st Street is not around Lawrence, or even 31st or 35th.
The original premise of this project had dual usage. It was going to relieve traffic on 23rd internally and what I call externally. So they were trying to, Kansas Department of Transportation wanted to go south of the river. They didn't want to go here. We shoved them up. And when I say we, not me, in 1984 I was on the Planning Commission and making mortgage loans. But the community wanted it to meet more than one need. If we were going to spend our money doing it, and if we were going to go through this kind of commitment, they wanted it to serve more than one purpose. It's 14 miles long. It has 14 entrances or opportunities to get on it. Some call it a development road. I don't particularly call an opportunity to get on every mile a development road, but some do. And so many think that the whole idea of this whole thing was to just, let Lawrence explode. And the truth is, if you really wanted development, you'd get it out as far as you could stand and get funding and just find new territory. And I don't think that's what we did. We've obviously got some challenges, but I don't think it was designed to be a development road.
Well, there are
So, go.
Well, there are tremendous disadvantages to the 3 alignments that
Oh, yeah.
the Douglas County has suggested are possible. First, we already have 9 miles of this traffic way built, and there were a great environmental damages done to build those 9 miles. The Elkins Prairie, for example, was plowed, which upset a tremendous number of people and caused a huge political problem that sort of was the beginning of the end, at least, or at least the hesitation to go on beyond that. The second big environmental issue then is going through the Baker Haskell wetlands, which is not only an environmental issue but also a religious spiritual issue, which we heard about from Dan Watkins. So how can you justify, or not Watkins, wrong guy, Dan Watkins.
You didn't hear it from Dan
no,
Watkins.
not from Dan Watkins. He's the one who sold all the
tell you.
land. Hello, Dan. How can you justify destroying these delicate environmental places just for a road? I mean, doesn't it make sense that since they're either here or they're not here, it's better to leave them for future generations and spend more money and go south of the river, for example, and than to go through it?
Yeah. Good comment. I'm not so sure we don't have some of the same, we don't have the Baker Haskell wetlands along this Wakarusa River Valley, but we do, I'm confident, have some environmental issues. And I know we'll need to span floodplains, and with that comes cost, but that's not what we're talking about right now. What you need to understand is that the other alignments that we looked at, assuming that you don't go south of the river, was an alignment that was referred to as the 35th Street alignment, which I hated from the get-go, and most people do, which divides the wetlands, the largest area of wetlands, in two. Okay? And I don't know a lot about wetlands, but I do know that the bigger the better. And the more complete an area can be, the better off it functions. That even makes sense to a guy like me. This also brought, quite frankly, at one time was acceptable, within reason, to some people. Came along this alignment north of the river, and truth be known, there's some area down there that is not, quote, wetland, because it doesn't meet all the tests associated with creating a wetland, which is it needs to be hydric, and you have to have plants and animals that are wetland types. And
Baker was satisfied with the 38th Street alignment, is that right?
No, Baker hated that.
Hated
Haskell Haskell, to be fair to Haskell, Haskell was adamant that 31st not be used. They weren't in the business of picking our alignment, but they didn't like this.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't like this, and if this worked for us and it could work, then I think they were reasonably comfortable with that. There are some people at Haskell that don't like any of this. There's some people in this audience that don't either. So when I say Haskell, I want to talk about Bob Martin, the president, and his board, who I think are doing a tremendous job to deal with this dilemma, because this is untenable for them also. They represent 160 tribes of Native Americans in this country, and I think my job's hard. That's not easy stuff, and they're doing what they can to protect Haskell Indian Nations University. The 38th Street came down here, and although didn't take as much wetland as this took the fewest wetland acres. This had some problems. The Corps of Engineers, who are in charge of taking care of some people think they are, of our waterways. Some people don't think they are, but they didn't like this one very well at all. And what we were trying to do is we were trying to get, quite frankly, Baker and Haskell and the state of Kansas and the federal government and EPA and the Corps of Engineers. And then there's some associated state agencies, Fish and Wildlife, and I don't have all the titles. But, you know, by the time you get them all in a room, it's crowded. And they all have different responsibilities and interests and had different impressions on what was going on here. And it was very difficult to, it is still very difficult to get anybody pulling on the rope the same way. Yes, sir.
It seems as if that you're a private developer, and I'm curious if that's true. You know, what is that sort of role that you play in, you know, working with the you know, public and the government? And
I'm in the real estate business, and we develop ground. We develop ground for single-family housing, and I don't know. You're going to have to keep asking me questions about how that plays into all this. I know I've been challenged or accused of, you know, having conflicts of interest and all those kinds of things. I don't know that my involvement in the South Lawrence Trafficway creates a conflict of interest, but obviously it can create an impression in that. I happen to think that the South Lawrence Trafficway or no Trafficway, that people still want to live in Lawrence, and they still want to live in new areas, and the demand is there to do that. That's my opinion. That may not be yours. Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain why you think that a no-build option would be beneficial to Haskell?
No, it's not beneficial.
Or what did you say?
I said no build, which is what we're doing today, talking about it, not building a roadway there or somewhere. The no build, the don't do anything, is what we're living with today. And what that means is that when K-10 opened in '82, that road system, K-10 to Kansas City, was starting at about 8,000 cars a day. Today, it's well in excess of 30. 31st Street today is 12,000 cars a day. It is time and a half what K-10 was the day it opened. So, in my personal opinion, I don't think that kind of traffic on the south end of Haskell's campus, and they've voiced that themselves, is not necessarily in their best interest. So doing nothing is not a good choice, in my opinion, for Douglas County, the state of Kansas, the community of Lawrence, and Haskell. And I think they believe that. Some do.
I want to look at the bigger picture for just a minute. Given the corporate hog farm issue that's potentially devastating to Quivira and the Cheyenne Bottoms area, does not the Baker wetland assume a greater importance as a bird flyway down the road, assuming that there will be some disastrous consequences in the middle part of Kansas?
Well, I don't know what you know about Cheyenne Bottoms, but
Well, I know that they're probably going to be threatened if there's large-scale corporate hog farming, as will be Quivira.
yeah. My support of the 31st Street alignment has everything to do with the Baker wetlands, and that is to create a better drainage system along that north end. In my opinion, it is technically not on the very tip of the north end of the wetlands. There's some wetlands that lie across the street on Haskell's campus, but it's kind of like so, okay? But assuming we've already ruined this ecologically, which I think we have with 31st Street, my attitude is we ought to stay on that alignment. Let's don't go find a new place to ruin. And I think there are some things we can do. I am not an ecologist, I am not an engineer, but there are some things we can do that can improve things. It can improve the supply of water to the wetlands. Believe it or not, water tips out of, many know this, water tips out of the Wakarusa and goes to a low point here. Usually you think that everything drains to the river. It doesn't exactly work there, and this is kind of the lowest area here. So there's some, and then there's drainage coming from the city of Lawrence and KU and all U and I. And it's coming down here, and we're trying to figure out better ways to get this drainage water in and around this area, supply it if it's needed, and don't if we don't. So in my opinion, the 31st Street alignment is the best one environmentally because we can control it somewhat. Now, lots of people go nuts on that.
And that's kind of in opposition to really what it stands for. Controlling the environment there is not what it originally was naturally intended as.
What's
Controlling the water flow to the south side of the 31st Street is really kind of, as I said, in opposition to what it really is. It's a natural flowing system.
And all I'm contending is that's the end of the road for it. This is the low point. Spills over from the Waukee and goes back. I mean,
Well, there are some other issues too besides controlling water, particularly the religious connotations and problems that Haskell
yes.
has found with that particular alignment. First of all, Haskell claims it wasn't consulted,
True.
which
I mean, true, they claim that.
that's what I said. They claim that that they weren't consulted, and the federal courts have said that the county has to do a supplemental environmental impact statement before you can go forward. How do you assess the religious claims of Haskell, and what's your answer to Haskell's grievances about not being consulted about this?
My assessment is that I can't know what you believe. I don't, whether you're Native American, Hindu, Jewish, First Presbyterian. I don't contend for 1 minute that I know what you ought to know about what you believe. So I assume that all the things you're concerned about are real. And I do with Haskell. I would have some of the same concerns. I think the difference is that I believe that we can make some of those concerns better, mitigate them, lessen them, make them so they're not as intrusive. They don't believe that. Or the last time we were discussing this in public, their position was that those kinds of mitigations aren't the kinds of mitigations that are going to work. So the difference isn't that I don't respect their beliefs, because I don't know. I mean, I've learned a lot from them, and it's been very educational, and I still don't get it. And they look at me, and I'm the white guy. There's no way that I'm going to get it. And I can try to get it all day long, and I won't get it in their eyes. But I do respect their feelings, and I do respect what they say they believe. I also believe that we can make it better. And we can make it so we can live together. Now, that historically does not bode well for them as a people either. You know, every time they sit down at the table to negotiate with the white guy, they lose. And so I have a respect for that historical background. I mean, I'm not naive to that. I don't expect to be trusted when I walk in the room. And I'm not. But I can't change who I am. And I can't change what I believe about the need for this road, for everybody in this room, and I don't care who you are and where you live, you're going to use it. Some will swear it off if it gets built, and that's great. But I believe it can be built, and I believe it can relieve traffic, and I believe we can mitigate the concerns of Haskell and save the wetlands and do it all. But we're certainly not there yet. Yes, ma'am.
I think obviously, I mean, it's just the way the city has been set up and developed from, the time that everyone settled here, and it's just unfortunate that there wasn't that foresight with the wetlands and all this growth. Are there predictions or models as far as population growth and how that will affect how much we need a road to maybe push this through, or to make people realize, I mean, there is no other way. I mean, ideally, the university could be picked up and moved, and everything could be moved to a different direction. How, I mean, will it be possible to support the population with just 23rd Street? I mean, something's going to happen.
It isn't now, in my opinion, but some say we don't have a traffic problem. I mean, we're already outliving the traffic numbers that got projected back there. Now, some don't believe it's going to relieve it either. If you don't believe it'll relieve it, then we're messing around here.
What about the theory that, and I think you even suggested it earlier, that roads create new development? I think you said that, and that new roads are filled up by new development. And if we took a road here south of the Wakarusa, that would only make Lawrence jump the Wakarusa and grow faster to the south, which I'm certain that it's going to do eventually. If you have a traffic way that goes around the south end of Lawrence and you increase the amount of development, the number of people who build out there, the number of commercial nodes that are made along that traffic way, even if it's not a strip way, it would seem that you're going to increase the total amount of traffic in the south of Lawrence, so that in the long run, this is going to fill up, and 23rd Street is going to get even heavier in terms of its traffic, because that's going to be one of the main business districts. That's sort of the new automobile business district. So my view is that although you will relieve 23rd Street traffic in the short term, in the long term, you won't, because there'll be thousands and thousands of more people down in this end of town.
Okay.
And they'll be using 23rd. So you're spending now $80 to $100 million, and it's really a short-term solution for 23rd.
Well, today we don't build 23rd Streets. Today, in theory, if we go south of the river and it's planned like we talk about it these days, we'll have nodal development that's designed to be neighborhood in nature. It's not designed to give you a mall on every corner. It's designed to get you gas and get you gum and get you, dry cleaning and the neighborhood ancillary services to living in a neighborhood. So in my perfect world, if I am in the city of Lawrence south of the Wakarusa River, I've only got 2 or 3 veins to get over here, and one of them is Highway 59. I don't have a need to find 23rd Street. If I'm going to work in Topeka or Kansas City, I can take access to the traffic way and go. So I'm not going to tell you that 23rd is going to slow down, it's going to be great, and we're going to walk kids across it. I'm not saying that. But the pressure on that system being, in effect, Highway 10, which it is, there's no question that we're relieving the pressure and allowing the serious problems associated with gridlock that you see in Kellogg, in Wichita, and places like that. We're buying time. And is $80 million worth 15 years of time and worry about what the heck we're going to do with 23rd? Whether we buy out all the commercial there or do ramps where we're driving over ourselves or whatever the great ideas have been. I don't know. It seems to me that it is.
There's a lot of discussion about alleviating traffic, and I understand that's necessary. I drive in from Kansas City, hit 23rd Street, and try to think of as many ways as possible to avoid that one section. What about economic effect on those businesses? I mean, has there been any studies done, complaints or whatever? What can you tell us about the economic effect on those businesses should traffic from Topeka to Kansas City be rerouted? I mean,
Yeah.
you're losing a lot of out-of-town visitors that now would spend the money off of 23rd Street.
Contrary to popular belief, we did have some public hearings about this from the 80s up to, well, actually the last one was in 92. And we did have people that own businesses on 23rd Street. And I can't tell you that they all think it's a great idea, and I won't. But if it's too crowded to get into my liquor store or my gas station or my mall's development or whatever it is, it's too crowded. And you've been on the going home side and been busy and needed to stop to get this or that. And I'm not saying 23rd, it could be Metcalf. I don't know. But my point is, if it's too darn busy, you're not going to stop. And when you get to your world that slows down a little bit and there's a little convenience store there, they're going to get you. And I do believe that's behavior that people live with. So I don't recall the concerns of 23rd Street business owners. I think they would love a little bit of relief, because I think it stops people from using them.
Yeah, number of trucks that stop at the Amp Ride at Iowa or excuse me, at Haskell and 23rd, I mean, that's a big stopping place for those trucks that come from Topeka. They're going to need another location to fuel because they expect to get gasoline in Lawrence.
23rd and where now?
And Haskell, you've got that.
Yeah, I got you, yeah.
And
Yeah, they're not going to get those guys. Some East 23rd businesses that, quite frankly, that's been developed since the 80s, right?
what I'm considering is the fact that if they expect to get gasoline, where are they going to get it if they're not at Haskell and 23rd, if they're routed to the south and then around it completely? If they need to get gasoline, where are they going to get it?
You mean everybody runs out right there? I mean, I can't, I don't know how
No,
to deal
but
with
trucks, but that is a very big truck stop.
that. Okay.
For the trucks. Automobiles, no, there are other options, but trucks specifically, I've noticed, passing through Lawrence do stop there.
Well, we've got DeSoto, you've got Eudora, you've got, eventually, the Turnpike sure wants them. They build an interchange to see if they'll come, and they sell that product. So I'm not, I mean, I haven't answered questions like that in a while, but I'm not worried about that. I'm not worried about that trucker. I want him, if he doesn't want to be here, I want him around and gone.
One of the things that I think you've learned about is how government operates in this kind of complex problem. There's Haskell, there's the Kansas Department of Transportation, there's Douglas County, there's the Federal Highway Administration, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Corps of Engineers, and Lord knows how many other governmental agencies have been involved in this. At one time or another, they must have agreed on this trafficway, and now there seems to be significant disagreement. What's happening? What's the cause of this?
Yeah, it's an interesting process and experience. Many times, agents are associated or affiliated, or their scope of interest is very narrow, and so they are ancillary to the process. In other words, it would be like we're going to build a building, and I have the architect and the contractor and the banker and the the person, the owner. But I have somebody that is my elevator specialist, and you're it. Now, you have to go to every meeting for the rest of your life on this project, because you need to know when it's your turn to deal with the elevator. And so what happens is my elevator guy gets sick and tired of this. I mean, he knows about elevators, but it's not his turn. It's not his time for his input. So we talk, and the leaders, and I'm not saying EPA is important in this, and the Corps is important, and KDOT and the federal government are important, but there's lots of other people that create input. And so when we finally get around to the elevator guy, he says, "Elevator won't work, you idiots." And here's 10 reasons why. And it's frustrating. I've always worked in private practice. I've served as a county commissioner, obviously, but and so productivity or accomplishments that you see are a little easier to measure, depending upon what you do. And people that teach and do those kinds of things, I have a tremendous amount of respect for, but it is hard to see when you get smart from what they tell you. And people that work in government, it is hard to see the reward that they have, quite frankly. Not only do I want him to come to the meeting, but I want to try to convince him to look at it just a little different. You're from EPA, or you're from Corps, or you're from somewhere, and you've got your checklist of 12 things. Would you consider taking a look at 9 and seeing if there's another way? Because this doesn't quite fit here. They do not get paid to do that. It doesn't change their paycheck. It doesn't change their vacation. It doesn't change their outlook on life. I'm not sure I'd do that. I wouldn't look at 9 either if I were them. And so we ran into lots of people who wouldn't look at 9 because it's different. We have people that want to support wholeheartedly the issues and concerns of Haskell, yet they know that no build is not good. They're conflicted. They don't know what to do. So they do what we're doing now. which is nothing. So it's really, it's not easy. And I'm not knocking them. They have an important part in all this. But there is not a scenario of accomplishment that you and I would see. I mean, they should be proud when they help build the road. But if your basic philosophy about protecting the environment is that we shouldn't build roads, which many believe, I guess me too. If you want to make sure nothing negative happens, don't do anything. Then, you know, selling the EPA to get that close to a wetland or a floodplain, that's a tough sell. And then there's politics and all that, and then don't get me started there.
You talk about like scenario of accomplishment, and these things are very reduced into like, I guess, I don't know, numbers or some. I'm not certain what you mean by that exactly, but it seems to me that part of this problem stems from the fact that there's a lot of pressure on a completely different part of town than right here. There's all this growth out west, and a lot of people are the ones who'll be using this road. And it seems to me that, you know, in all this talk about scenarios of routes and roads, that maybe we should be talking about this growth out west and perhaps doing something about that to maybe alleviate the pressure on traffic. I'm not saying that if people want to, you know, build, you know, we should deny them that desire or that dream.
Why not?
But what I'm saying
Why
is,
shouldn't we?
well, I'm not saying if they buy land, you know, it becomes an issue. What I'm saying is maybe we should talk about that. I don't hear us talking about, you know, getting people to stop growing west and moving west and putting pressure on 23rd Street.
Well, you know, Don talked about it a little bit, you know, from whether you're a farmer from the 30s or the 90s. You know, someday you may want to build a house. Boy, think long and hard before you do. Because, you know, there are lots of places, and to some, Lawrence ought to be one where we ought to do that. Where we ought to say, no, not you, not now. Go buy something else. Go buy something old. Rent, don't own. I mean, that's where all this gets real difficult for me. I guess I need to understand that what's occurring out west shouldn't occur. And I guess if I can be convinced that it shouldn't, and if I can look people in the eye and say, no, shouldn't be there. Don't live in the country either, because you're creating difficult infrastructure on the ambulance that's going to save your life, and on a rural fire department that doesn't have any money, and a township that can't keep your roads with gravel on. My difficulty in government and in life is I don't know who to tell no to. I guess that's my dilemma. And I've honestly always been conflicted with that. I don't know who to say no to. And if you're willing and want to do that, I guess I think we ought to figure out a way to make room for you. And I grew up here. I mean, I could be very territorial, very selfish. This community changes 20% every year. I mean, to find people that have been here for 30 years, it's kind of hard to find. And the truth is, what makes it cool, what makes it worth being here is you guys. That's the truth. Because if you didn't change and bring ideas and come and have fun and do all the things that you do, we'd be Ottawa. And I don't say that out of disrespect for Ottawa. Lawrence High used to compete with Ottawa. And our enrollments were very much the same, even in my lifetime, in the 60s, when I was a kid. And I liked some people in Ottawa. But it's not Lawrence. So I guess if I could get that one answered, I don't think I'd have a problem in the world. But I don't have that one figured out. And you know, this is a great place for people upper middle class that have some money, white. It's great. What about those that aren't? I mean, I kind of want to make room for them too. And I'm not sure quite how to do it. The affordability of housing is always an issue that we fight in this community. But I don't want to tell you it's not your place. It's not your place to land or end or not be here. Get to school and then get out. You know, go home, go back to Johnson County or wherever. I don't want to say that to you. So I can't get that one figured out. Now, if you truly believe that all this was about building roads for Western development, then boy, we orchestrated it absolutely perfectly. We got 2/3 of it built from 59 to Highway to the Turnpike, and then we found a reason to blow it up. And here we sit. And now everybody's got to go west. I mean, it just makes me giggle when I hear that one. Because that has been accused all along. This is Billings Highway, you know? That's all you're doing is building a place for people to get off and play golf. Well, if you believe it, and if you think we're that smart, we did it. And we had to, we had to get Haskell involved to do it. And I don't believe that. The most important thing, most important project in this community, until it's done, is to get people through this town that don't want to be here, out of here. If you live on the north side, you don't live with it every day. But if you live anywhere else, you do.
I think this sort of hooks into the issue of conflicts of interest, which you've faced a number of times, and all politicians, I suppose, do from time to time face this. Our past mayor, her interest in the Corpus Christi Church and the possibility that the city might want to buy that church and convert it into a recreational center. She's a member of that church. You faced it, therefore, you faced it over the South Lawrence Traffic Way, that you are a real estate salesperson, and what you want to do is to increase development. Therefore, the South Lawrence Traffic Way can only help you.
Sure.
Could you discuss the current law on conflict of interest and how you square your own situation with it? And should politicians routinely recuse themselves from these apparent conflicts of interest, even if there isn't an actual conflict?
Yeah. We have a law, and I can't cite you verse and page, but when I run, or choose to run and then become elected, I need to tell you in a public disclosure document what I own regarding real estate. I don't think I have to tell you if I own AT&T, but if I have a partnership, I have to tell you what my real estate holdings are, and if my client were Douglas County, I don't know who has Douglas County as a client, but if that were what I did, I'd have to disclose that. I am obviously in the real estate business, and we're in the business of selling what people have to sell and what people want to buy. I don't think being in the real estate business creates a conflict of interest in a municipal project. I don't think it creates an interest, they do this measurement on whether I have something to gain. I guess if I'd sold a bunch of right-of-way in it, that's getting pretty smelly. That's pretty ugly. If I worked on it, if I were an engineer and got hired, that'd be pretty greasy. So there's a law that says you have to tell us all this stuff, and then what's interesting is if you disclose your conflict of interest, it doesn't preclude you from voting on it. Now that's nuts. Imagine that. Yes, I own 25% of an engineering firm that got hired. Yes, I think it's a great job. Great project. We're all happy. That's all I have to do is disclose it. Well, I don't think that's the way to play. And I think if there are conflicts, real, and sometimes imagined, that you ought to bail out. If a project isn't good enough to go with 2 commissioners, it's not good enough to go. I was on the Planning Commission. There were 10 of us there. If you're involved in something, don't vote on it. Tell them that you're not, tell them why, and don't vote on it. Now, behind all this, and behind all the rules and all the laws has to do with, they want us to, I want your trust. I want the public to know what people do and have that could affect them personally and affect the government they work for. So there are times that I think I recuse myself, sometimes when I don't have to. I'm pretty sensitive about it. But I don't think being in the real estate business makes you a traffic way builder. Because I think, quite frankly, most people like to be on residential streets, and a highway of this magnitude, I quite frankly wouldn't want to live near it. So to be totally selfish with you, I think it's got some negative impacts along the way. But But it happens. Some people, you know, all you got to do sometimes is just say the word real estate, and you know, that puts you in a different class, I guess. But I, you know, kind of wanted to stay here in Lawrence, and the service industry is kind of growth industry in the 80s, and I don't have all the education this guy does, and probably couldn't do what he does. So it was an obvious choice for me, and it's an honorable job, and I'm glad I do it.
Maybe we can wrap up the traffic way with one last question and then go on to some other things. There have been a lot of rumors about the traffic way in the past.
The most rumored project in the world.
People use rumors. They use and misuse information for their own political purposes. Could we try to settle the most recent rumor, which I've gotten off the net? Some people are saying that a meeting occurred on April the 2nd in the governor's office about the future of the traffic way. Besides the governor, the following people supposedly were present: President Martin of Haskell, President Lambert of Baker University, Gary Tobin of the Lawrence Chamber of Commerce, and other parties, perhaps including the Secretary of the Kansas Department of Transportation. Supposedly the purpose of this meeting was to finalize a plan in which Haskell would receive funds for various uses in exchange for not objecting to the 31st Street alignment. Anything to this rumor? Is this possible? Do you know anything about it? Can you clarify this?
Yeah, I can't clarify the scenario that you have. Let me tell you what I think everybody is interested in doing, some of those people. I think Governor Graves, you need to understand, if you don't know, that this file, the South Lawrence Trafficway file, imagine you go home to do homework and there's this file, it's like this, and instead of going away, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and it's always on your desk. It never goes away. And I would think Bill Graves would love for the SLT to get solved. Probably doesn't care what they do as long as they solve it. And I would think Bob Martin has those same interests, because he wants to run a Native American university. He don't want Jack with a highway. Dan Lambert wants to do the same thing. He wants to run a private university in Baldwin that happens to own the wetlands. They want to protect their interests. They want to do the right thing. So they might have met with the governor. Now, federal funds and finalizing a deal and all those juicy words that give everybody this great stuff to talk about, I don't know. I've been in a lot of meetings, and trust me, I was never at one that even had the slightest thought that it was the final to anything. And I wasn't at that meeting. Not that they couldn't do quite well without me.
So there was a meeting?
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know. But if there were and those people were there, that's what I'd be talking about. And I want to say something about Bob Martin, and I want to say it. Bob Martin didn't ask me. Bob Martin doesn't want me speaking for him. But Bob Martin came to this university with some dilemmas out there, and quite frankly has done a tremendous job at keeping the wheels on, I think, regarding this issue. Haskell's been blamed for an awful lot of the problems associated with stopping the road. And Bob Martin isn't built that way. He's doing the best that he can, and he's protecting the interests of the people that he works for and cares about, and he ought to. And he's done a great job. I can't say enough about him, and he may be in a more untenable situation than anybody in this scenario because of the diverse interests that he represents. So,
Can I just ask you why you think, you say that this eventually is going to be built, so do you think the environmental impact statement will have no effect on the wetlands at all? Why do you say this road is going to be built regardless?
well, in an environmental impact statement or a supplemental environmental impact statement, they do set out opportunities to mitigate environmental issues. I mean, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but we mitigated the acreage that we would take by the development on the 31st Street alignment. And we've already bought that ground and planted it to wetland and watered it or whatever it is you do, and it's working pretty well. Now, it is not a wetland. And in some people's minds, it'll never be a wetland. But if you went out there today, you'd get people to say it's starting to look like a wetland. So there are things that can be done. Now, whether they're things that you think are acceptable or not, I'll never know. But that is what an EIS does. It says these are our problems, these are our challenges, these are the solutions.
Well, we're at the end of our television portion of the discussion, Mark, and I appreciate very much your coming to do this yet again. I'm sure that you've spoken more words on the South Lawrence Traffic Way than you have on almost any other subject in your life. And you spent nearly 10 years of your life on the county commission, and most of those years have been involved with the South Lawrence Traffic Way, which you still don't have finished and will not have finished when you leave office. So it must be somewhat of a frustration for you, but I'm sure you're looking forward to a private life again, and you won't have to answer all these questions in the future.
You know, I actually, this is the part I like. I mean, I don't like controversy. I like people being upset. This is, but I like this kind of interaction, and this is the stuff I'll miss. So, thank you.
Thank you a lot for coming.